The building loomed at the edge of town, forgotten by time and overrun by decay. Old bricks, marred by graffiti, jutted out like broken teeth, and shattered windows stared down at the street like empty eyes. It was St. Mary's Academy, closed for nearly 30 years after a fire had ravaged the West Wing. The rumors, however, told of something far more sinister than an electrical malfunction. Jody was the ringleader that night, dragging her reluctant friends to the school under the pretense of finding proof of its haunted reputation. 5 of them stood at the rusted gates, armed with flashlights and shaky bravado. Jody, her boyfriend Nate, Alyssa, Marcus, and timid little Erin, who clutched her phone like a lifeline. "Just an hour," Jody promised, grinning. "We'll check out the classrooms, maybe the gym. You can say you've been to the most haunted place in town." Easy bragging rights. Erin shifted nervously, glancing up at the building's gaping maw of a front door. "I don't think we should be here." "Don't chicken out now," Jody replied, already pushing the gate open with a shriek of rusted hinges. "Come on. You'll thank me later." The others hesitated, but peer pressure and a stubborn desire not to be the first to leave drove them forward. The air inside was thick, musty, and oppressive, carrying the faint metallic tang of old blood. Their flashlights cut through the gloom, illuminating broken desks, tattered banners, and a long-abandoned chalkboard smeared with faded writing. "Does anyone else feel like we're being watched?" Alyssa whispered as they crept through the hallways, their footsteps echoing unnaturally loud. "That's just the vibe of the place," Nate said, his voice steady but his eyes darting nervously. "It's empty. There's nothing here. But there was something." It started subtly, with the quiet creak of a locker door swinging open down the hall. They froze, flashlights whipping toward the sound, but there was nothing, just the silent rows of rusting lockers. Then came the footsteps, faint and distant, like someone pacing in the upper floors. "Probably just rats," Marcus offered, though his voice wavered. "Yeah, big rats," Jody said with a nervous laugh. "Let's check out the gym. That's where they say the weird stuff happens." The gym was worse than the rest of the school, its floor warped and splintered, the remains of bleachers clawed apart by time. The basketball hoop dangled precariously, its net long gone. In the center of the room, something odd stood out. A single child-sized desk, pristine amidst the decay. "Okay, that's creepy," Alyssa said, her voice tight. "Probably staged by some other kids," Jody said, though she kept her distance from the desk. "It's not like ghosts are real." As if in answer, the temperature plummeted. Their breath fogged the air, and the faint sound of laughter, high-pitched and distorted, echoed from the walls. Erin whimpered, clutching Nate's arm. "We should leave," she said, her voice shaking. Just a few more minutes," Jody insisted, but her confidence had cracked. The laughter grew louder, swelling into a cacophony that seemed to come from every corner of the gym. The lights of their flashlights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. Panic set in, and they scrambled toward the door, only to find it shut tight, the handle icy and unyielding. "Help! Someone help us!" Marcus shouted, pounding on the door. The laughter stopped, replaced by silence so deep it seemed to crush them. Then, one by one, they heard their names whispered, soft and venomous. "Nate, Alyssa, Marcus, Erin, Jody." "Who's there?" Jody screamed, spinning in circles with her flashlight that refused to stay lit. The whispers turned into screams, agony, terror, despair. Shadows began to writhe along the walls, forming shapes that stretched and reached for them. Nate grabbed Erin's hand, pulling her toward a side door they hadn't noticed before. "Now!" he yelled. They burst through the door into a narrow hallway, the screams and shadows chasing them. The air grew heavier, their legs like lead as they ran. They didn't stop until they reached the main entrance. The front doors somehow wide open, spilling moonlight onto the cracked floor. One by one, they stumbled outside, gasping for breath. Only then did they realize Jody was missing. "Jody?" Nate called, his voice hoarse. He turned to run back in, but the doors slammed shut, a deafening finality that shook the ground. "She's gone," Erin whispered, tears streaming down her face. "No," Nate said, pounding on the door. "No. Open up." Inside, the laughter resumed, mocking and cruel. Jody's screams rose above it, raw and desperate, then abruptly cut off. The group fled, leaving the school behind. They never spoke of that night, and Jody was never found. But sometimes on quiet nights, if you stand near the gates of St. Mary's Academy, you can hear the laughter, and her voice, faint and pleading, calling for help. And if you're foolish enough to answer, the door will creak open, just wide enough to let you in.
Story number 2.
The town of Black Hollow had a secret, one that lived in the bowels of Elmwood High. The school had been abandoned for nearly 40 years after a tragedy no one liked to talk about. Parents who grew up in the area whispered about the incident, though no one could agree on what actually happened. Some said the entire senior class vanished one night. Others claimed a teacher had gone mad and locked everyone inside. When Kayla and her friends, Chris, Elena, and Devon, decided to explore the school, it wasn't just for fun. They'd heard the stories, and Kayla was determined to prove that the place wasn't haunted. "It's just an old building," she said, pushing open the warped double doors. The air inside was wrong, stale and sharp, like the smell of iron mixed with something sweet. Dust floated in thick clouds, and the pale moonlight from the shattered windows cast eerie patterns on the floor. "All right," Chris said, his voice louder than necessary. "We're here. Let's see what the fuss is about." The group moved cautiously, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. The walls were covered in strange, faint scratches, long, looping patterns like someone had been scribbling nonsense. Desks were overturned, papers scattered, and a large black stain marred the floor of the main hallway. "What's that?" Elena whispered, pointing to the stain. "Old paint or something," Kayla said quickly, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. She stepped over it and led the way toward the auditorium. The auditorium was worse. The air was colder here, and the seats seemed to be arranged differently than they should have been, angled toward the stage in a way that made them look like they were leaning forward, hungry. Chris moved to the stage and found an old microphone, its cord frayed and sparking. "Testing. 1, 2, 3, he said with a grin. The speakers crackled, but instead of his voice, a faint whisper emerged, too quiet to understand. "Turn it off," Elena snapped, backing away. "It's just feedback," Chris said, but even he looked unnerved. He dropped the microphone and the whispering stopped, only to be replaced by soft footsteps echoing above them, coming from the balcony. Kayla shone her flashlight up, but the beam barely reached. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. No answer. "Let's get out of here," Devon said. Before anyone could agree, the stage lights, ancient, rusted things, flickered on, bathing the auditorium in a sickly yellow glow. The balcony was empty, but the seats were not. Figures sat in every row, their heads bowed, faces obscured by shadows. They weren't there a moment ago. The group froze, staring in silent horror. Slowly, one of the figures lifted its head. Its face was wrong, stretched too wide with hollow sockets where eyes should have been. Then it smiled. The figures stood as one, their movements jerky and unnatural like puppets on tangled strings. "Run!" Kayla screamed, pulling her friends toward the nearest exit. They bolted through the halls, the sound of footsteps behind them growing louder, faster, like the figures were leaping and scrambling after them. The walls seemed to shift, twisting and narrowing. Devon tripped, and when Kayla turned to help him, she saw one of the figures descending on him, its mouth impossibly wide. Devon's scream was short-lived. The others didn't look back. They burst through the front doors into the night, panting and shaking. But something was wrong. The town was gone. Instead of their familiar streets, they stood on a barren plain under a blood-red sky. The school loomed behind them, its windows glowing with flickering light. "What the hell?" Chris whispered, his voice breaking. Elena pointed back at the building, her hand trembling. "It's watching us." The school itself seemed alive, its bricks shifting subtly, its darkened doorway stretching into a jagged grin. The air around them grew heavy, oppressive, and the sound of footsteps returned, this time from every direction. Figures emerged from the shadows, their faces twisted, their bodies contorted. They were the students and teachers from the old photos, the ones who'd vanished all those years ago. "We shouldn't have come," Elena sobbed, clutching Kayla's arm. The figures moved closer, their empty eyes fixed on the group. Kayla tried to scream, but no sound came out, and then the world went black. The next morning, Elmwood High stood silent and empty, as it always had. The only sign of the intruders was Kayla's flashlight, lying just inside the doorway, its beam flickering faintly before fading out forever.
Story number 3.
The Asherwood School for Girls had been shuttered for decades, its ivy-choked walls hiding stories of despair and madness. Built in the late 1800s, the school had once been a prestigious academy, but something dark had taken root within its stone corridors. Students whispered about the Watcher, an unseen entity that seemed to know their deepest fears. The disappearances started soon after, and when the school finally closed, it was as though the building itself sighed in relief. But urban explorers don't believe in stories. Mia, Derek, and Sophie were thrill-seekers, drawn to the macabre and forbidden. The school was the crown jewel of their ghost-hunting endeavors. They slipped through the iron gates just after midnight, their flashlights cutting beams through the fog. The air grew colder as they approached the main doors. Sophie hesitated. "It feels wrong," she murmured. "That's the point," Derek said with a grin, pushing the heavy door open. Inside, the school was a tomb. Dust coated every surface, and the faint smell of mildew mixed with something metallic and sour. Their footsteps echoed unnaturally, as though the building were mimicking the sound. They began in the classrooms. Ancient desks stood in neat rows, but the chalkboards were smeared with strange, angular symbols that none of them recognized. "Looks like graffiti," Mia said, though her voice was tight. She ran her fingers over one of the symbols, then pulled back sharply. "It's wet." Sophie shone her flashlight over the mark, and they saw a dark, oozing substance trailing down the board. It wasn't paint. "Let's keep moving," Derek said quickly, leading them into the main hallway. The photographs on the wall stopped them cold. Black and white class portraits of girls in stiff uniforms stared out at them, but something was wrong. In every photo, one figure was blurred, a tall shadow at the edge of the group. "Did cameras even do that back then?" Sophie whispered. Mia shook her head, her hand tightening on her flashlight. "No, that's not normal." As they moved deeper into the school, the shadows seemed to thicken, pressing against their lights. They found the library, a cavernous room filled with rotting books and overturned chairs. "Let's split up," Derek suggested. "Are you insane?" Mia snapped. "We'll cover more ground. Just stay close enough to hear each other." Reluctantly, they spread out. Sophie stayed near the door, her eyes scanning the rows of crumbling shelves. Mia ventured toward the far corner where a single candle flickered inexplicably on a desk. Derek wandered between the aisles, his flashlight catching movement out of the corner of his eye. "Hello?" he called, his voice shaky. There was no response, but the air grew colder. He turned a corner and froze. A figure stood at the end of the aisle, a girl in a tattered uniform, her head bowed, hair hanging in matted clumps over her face. "Hey, are you?" Before he could finish, the girl's head snapped up. Her face was featureless, a smooth expanse of pale flesh. She lunged toward him with inhuman speed, and Derek's scream echoed through the library. Mia and Sophie ran to find him, but he was gone. His flashlight lay on the floor, its beam illuminating claw marks gouged into the wood. "We need to leave," Sophie said, her voice trembling. Mia nodded, and they sprinted back toward the entrance. But the hallways had changed, twisting into a labyrinth. Doors that had been open were now shut, and strange whispers began to fill the air, soft and guttural, like a language that shouldn't exist. The walls themselves seemed alive, the plaster bulging as though something was trying to break through. "Don't stop," Mia urged, dragging Sophie along. But Sophie froze, her eyes wide with terror. "Mia, the photographs." Mia turned to look. The class portraits on the walls had changed. Now they featured her and Sophie, their faces pale and terrified, standing among the other ghostly figures. "We're not getting out," Sophie whispered. "Yes, we are," Mia said, though tears streaked her face. They reached the entrance hall, and for a moment it seemed they were free. The heavy doors stood open, the fog outside curling like beckoning fingers. But as they ran, the floor gave way beneath them. They tumbled into darkness, landing in a stone chamber lit by hundreds of candles. The angular symbols from the chalkboards were etched into the walls, pulsating with a sickly red light. In the center of the room stood a tall figure cloaked in shadow, its face obscured. "The Watcher," Sophie whispered, her voice breaking. The figure raised an impossibly long arm, pointing at them. The whispers grew deafening, and the walls began to close in. Mia grabbed Sophie's hand. "Wake up," she screamed, but they weren't dreaming. Days later, locals reported strange lights and sounds coming from the old school. When police searched the building, they found no sign of the trespassers. But the class portraits had changed again. Now 3 new faces stared out from the photographs, and in the far corner of every frame, the Watcher stood, smiling.
Story number 4.
The Briar Ridge School had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. Sitting atop a craggy hill, its jagged silhouette was a fixture against the skyline of a town that whispered of curses. The story went that in 1957, a teacher named Miss Elsabeth Ward went mad and locked her students inside, burning the school to the ground. Their screams, they said, still echoed through the ruins. Emma, Jake, and Sarah didn't believe in curses or ghosts. The 3 friends were amateur paranormal investigators, and Briar Ridge was their latest target. Armed with cameras, flashlights, and a Ouija board, they climbed the hill as a storm brewed overhead. The school was a carcass of stone and rotted wood. The roof had partially caved in, exposing the skeletal beams to the sky. Vines clawed their way up the walls, and shattered glass crunched underfoot as they stepped through the doorway. "This place is a death trap," Jake muttered, shining his flashlight across the graffiti-streaked walls. "Which makes it perfect," Emma replied, her excitement undeterred. They set up in what was once the main corridor, laying the Ouija board on a desk charred black by fire. The storm outside rumbled louder, the first drops of rain spattering against the floor. "Are there any spirits here?" Emma asked, placing her fingers lightly on the planchette. Jake and Sarah exchanged glances before joining her. At first, nothing happened. The air was still, the silence broken only by the faint patter of rain. Then the planchette moved. It jerked sharply, spelling out Leave. Sarah's hand flew away. "Okay, I'm out," she said, her voice quivering. "Don't be ridiculous," Emma replied, though her own hands trembled. "This is what we came for." "What's your name?" she asked aloud. The planchette moved again, faster this time. "Ward. "Miss Ward," Jake said softly. A deafening crash echoed through the hallway as a door slammed shut, sending dust and debris raining down. Their flashlights flickered, plunging them into sporadic darkness. "We're done here," Sarah said, grabbing her bag. As they turned to leave, a child's laughter echoed through the corridor, a soft, eerie giggle that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Emma whipped her flashlight toward the sound, catching a glimpse of something small darting into a nearby classroom. "Wait," she said, moving toward the door. "Are you serious?" Jake hissed. She ignored him, pushing the door open. Inside, the room was wrecked. Desks overturned, the blackboard cracked in half. In the far corner, a child stood facing the wall. Her hair was matted, her dress blackened and torn. "Hey," Emma called out gently, stepping closer. The girl turned, and Emma froze. Her face was skeletal, the flesh burned away, empty eye sockets weeping black ichor. The girl opened her mouth, and a guttural, inhuman scream filled the room. Jake and Sarah dragged Emma back into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind them. "We're leaving, now," Jake barked. But the hallway had changed. It stretched endlessly in both directions, lined with doors that hadn't been there before. The storm outside was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. "We're trapped," Sarah whispered. "No, we just need to." Jake stopped mid-sentence, his flashlight flickering. At the end of the hallway, a figure emerged. It was tall, its body twisted and charred like blackened wood. It wore the tattered remains of a teacher's dress, and its face was a hollow mask of flame. "Miss Ward?" Emma breathed. The figure raised an arm, pointing at them. The doors lining the hallway burst open, and children spilled out, dozens of them, their faces burned and distorted, their eyes empty voids. "They're blocking the exit," Jake shouted, pulling Emma and Sarah down the opposite direction. The children's laughter followed them, growing louder and more distorted with every step. The hallway twisted, folding in on itself like a maze. The air grew hotter, suffocating, the walls beginning to glow with embers. "We're going in circles," Sarah screamed. "No, keep moving," Emma yelled. They burst into a room that hadn't been there before. It was the school's auditorium, perfectly preserved, as though untouched by time. The seats were filled with children, their skeletal faces turned toward the stage. Miss Ward stood at the podium, her hollow eyes fixed on the newcomers. "You stayed too long," she said, her voice a rasping hiss. The doors slammed shut behind them, and the room erupted into flames. The next morning, the townsfolk woke to find the storm had passed, but Briar Ridge was gone. The hill where it had stood was nothing but scorched earth. Of Emma, Jake, and Sarah there was no trace. But on stormy nights, locals swear they hear the laughter of children echoing down from the hill and see the faint glow of fire where Briar Ridge once stood.
Story number 5.
The Danvers Institute had been left to rot on the edge of the woods, its hulking frame overrun with moss and vines. Once a prestigious boarding school, it had been abruptly shut down in the 1970s after a series of unexplained events. Locals said the woods swallowed it, taking the children and teachers with it. Officially, there had been a gas explosion, but the truth was darker. Tasha, Marcus, and Jenna decided to spend the night in the ruins for a ghost hunting challenge. Equipped with cameras, flashlights, and a handful of snacks, they entered just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The inside of the school was eerily well preserved. Lockers stood half open, some still containing books and belongings, as if the students had been plucked away midday. Dust blanketed everything, and a strange dampness clung to the air. "This place is a time capsule," Jenna whispered, shining her flashlight across faded posters still clinging to the walls. Yeah, but it reeks, Marcus said, wrinkling his nose. Let's find the auditorium, Tasha suggested, pulling out her camera. That's where the real creepy stuff always happens. As they wandered, the air grew heavier. Their footsteps echoed unnaturally, each sound stretching longer than it should. The hallways seemed to twist in ways that didn't make sense. Jenna noticed the lockers were numbered strangely, jumping from 12 to 45, then back to 3. Guys, this isn't right, she said, her voice shaky. Relax, Marcus said. It's just an old building. But his bravado faltered when they heard it. Faint laughter, like children playing, drifting down the hallway. Is someone else here? Jenna asked, her eyes darting nervously. No way, Tasha replied, though she didn't sound convinced. The sound grew louder as they turned a corner and found the gymnasium. The door creaked open, revealing a scene of chaos. Basketballs were scattered across the floor, and the scoreboard flickered faintly, displaying a score of 66-66. Let's check this out, Tasha said, moving forward with her camera. As her light swept the bleachers, they froze. Sitting in the top row was a figure, small, hunched, and unmoving. Who's there? Marcus called. The figure stood, and they saw it was a child, her face pale and gaunt, her hair hanging limp over her shoulders. She didn't speak, just pointed toward the far doors of the gym. We should go, Jenna said, already backing away. Wait, Tasha insisted, following the direction of the child's point. Maybe there's something there. The doors creaked open as if welcoming them, revealing a hallway bathed in a sickly green glow. Against their better judgment, they followed. The hallway seemed impossibly long, and the further they walked, the more the walls seemed to close in. A strange hum filled the air, vibrating through their chests. Tasha, turn back, Jenna pleaded. But Tasha pressed forward until they reached a classroom at the end of the hall. Its door swung open, revealing rows of desks covered in a thick layer of ash. On the blackboard was a single sentence scrawled in dripping red. You can still learn. What the hell is this? Marcus whispered, his voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, the door slammed shut behind them, and the air grew icy. Desks began to move, scraping across the floor as if dragged by invisible hands. The children appeared then, half-formed figures with hollow eyes, their charred hands reaching out. They surrounded the 3 friends, whispering in a language none of them could understand. One child stepped forward, her face burned beyond recognition. Her eyes glowed like embers as she held out her hand to Jenna. Take it, the girl rasped, her voice like dry leaves. Jenna screamed and stumbled back, knocking over a desk. The lights flickered and the walls began to bleed a thick black liquid. Run! Marcus shouted, kicking the door open. They fled through the twisting hallways, but no matter which direction they turned, they always ended up back in the same classroom. The whispers followed them, growing louder, and the shadows of the children stretched impossibly long, clawing at their heels. Finally, they burst into the library. It was pristine, untouched by time, but the books were wrong. Their covers were blank, and when Tasha opened one, the pages were filled with names, hundreds of them, written in trembling script. At the bottom of the page was her own name. What is this? She gasped. Jenna screamed, pointing to the far end of the library. Standing there was a towering figure, a teacher, her face obscured by shadows, her hands outstretched like talons. You will stay, the figure intoned, her voice filling the room. Class is in session. The doors slammed shut and the windows vanished, leaving them trapped in darkness. The last thing they heard was the sound of chalk on a board, scratching out 3 new names to join the others. The next day, the ruins of the Danvers Institute remained silent. No one saw the 3 friends again, but locals swore they heard faint laughter in the woods. And if you looked through the cracked windows, you might see the faint glow of green light and the shadow of a teacher, always watching.
Story number 6.
Every town has its secrets, and in Ridgewood, it was the Pine Hollow Elementary School. For years, the crumbling building had been fenced off, yet everyone avoided it. Stories of strange noises, ghostly apparitions, and missing people were enough to keep even the bravest away. But for Adam, Maya, and Chris, those were just stories. The 3 friends were thrill seekers, always looking for the next adrenaline rush. They decided to explore Pine Hollow on Halloween night, armed with a single flashlight, a cheap camcorder, and nerves of steel, or so they thought. The air was thick with mist as they squeezed through a gap in the rusted fence. The school loomed ahead, its shattered windows like empty eyes. A faint smell of decay wafted from inside. This is going to be epic, Adam whispered, his voice cracking slightly. Yeah, if we don't get tetanus first, Maya muttered, eyeing the rust and grime on the door as Chris pushed it open. The inside was a frozen moment in time. Desks lay overturned, papers scattered across the floor. A lone chalkboard still bore the faded remnants of a lesson. Behavior shapes futures. Creepy, Maya said, running her fingers along the chalkboard. Chris aimed the camcorder down the hall, its dim light casting shadows that seemed to dance on the peeling walls. Let's check out the gym, he said, leading the way. The gym was cavernous and cold, its floor warped and splintered. A single basketball sat in the center, inexplicably clean amid the decay. Was that here when we came in? Adam asked nervously. I don't think so, Maya replied, her eyes scanning the room. A loud bang echoed from behind them, and they all whipped around. The door they had just entered was shut. Wind, Chris said quickly, though the lack of breeze made his explanation unconvincing. They turned back to the gym, but it wasn't empty anymore. The bleachers were filled with shadowy figures, their heads tilted unnaturally as they stared. Run, Maya whispered, but before they could move, the figures stood as one. They weren't people, they were children, their faces pale and lifeless, their eyes black pits. They began to chant in unison, a low, rhythmic hum that made the air vibrate. Out now, Chris shouted, dropping the camcorder as they bolted. They sprinted down the hall, but it seemed endless. The walls began to close in, the floor sagging beneath their feet. Doors slammed shut one by one, trapping them in a corridor that felt alive, pulsating like a beating heart. They stumbled into a classroom. The desks were neatly arranged, each bearing a name carved deeply into the wood. Adam approached one. This is my name, he said, his voice trembling. Maya and Chris found theirs too. The carvings were fresh, the wood around the letters raw and splintered. Before they could react, the lights flickered, and a figure appeared at the front of the classroom. It was the teacher, her body a twisted parody of humanity. Her limbs were too long, her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, and her eyes glowed a sickly yellow. Class is in session, she rasped, her voice echoing unnaturally. No one leaves until the lesson is complete. The windows vanished, replaced by solid walls. The desks slid across the floor, trapping the trio in their seats. The teacher began to write on the blackboard, her hand moving faster than seemed possible. The words she wrote burned themselves into their minds. Obedience is survival. Adam tried to stand, but invisible hands pinned him down. Maya screamed as the air grew thick and suffocating. Chris clawed at his desk, but his fingers passed through it like smoke. The children from the gym appeared again, surrounding the classroom. Their chanting grew louder, a discordant symphony of despair. Suddenly, the teacher stopped writing and turned to them. Her grin widened, and her voice dropped to a chilling whisper. You're part of the school now. The lights flickered one last time, plunging the room into darkness. When the sun rose the next morning, Pine Hollow Elementary stood silent. Chris's camcorder was found outside the gym, its tape, playing a loop of shadowy figures and distorted chanting. Adam, Maya, and Chris were never seen again. But some say if you listen closely near the ruins, you can hear the faint echo of a lesson being taught, and the whispers of children repeating their lines, forever trapped in Pine Hollow's final class.
Story number 7.
The old Whitmore Academy had been shuttered for decades, its once grand architecture now a crumbling ruin at the edge of town. Stories swirled about why it closed, whispers of students vanishing and teachers who lost their minds. Yet one legend stood out, the tale of Room 306. According to local lore, any student who entered Room 306 alone never came out. Some claimed they could still hear the scratching of fingernails on the inside of the locked door, but no one had dared to investigate in years. Until tonight. Kelly, James, and Lila were thrill seekers who prided themselves on debunking urban legends. With flashlights in hand and a handheld recorder, they decided to explore Whitmore Academy. The front doors were chained, but James found a broken window near the science lab. As they climbed in, the air inside was suffocatingly stale, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something metallic. This place is a maze, Kelly whispered, her flashlight sweeping across lockers that had long since rusted shut. We'll find it, James replied, more to convince himself than the others. They wandered the eerie halls, their footsteps muffled by layers of dust and debris. Old announcements still clung to the walls, their edges curled and yellowed. Finally, they found it. Room 306. The door was heavy and bore deep scratches, as if someone or something had desperately tried to claw its way out. This is it, James said, swallowing hard. Looks like every other creepy door in this place, Lila muttered, though her voice wavered. Kelly turned the knob, and to their surprise, it opened easily. The room inside was undisturbed. Desks stood neatly arranged, and an old blackboard still bore the faded chalk outline of a lesson. "Let's set up here," Kelly said, unpacking their equipment. They placed the recorder on a desk and began asking questions. "Is anyone here with us?" Kelly asked. The room was silent. "Did something happen here?" James tried. A faint creak echoed from the far corner of the room. Their flashlights swung toward it, revealing a single desk with the lid slightly ajar. "Anyone else see that move?" Lila whispered. They cautiously approached. Inside the desk was an old notebook. Its pages were brittle, the ink smudged with age, but one sentence stood out, scrawled repeatedly. "Don't look at the windows." A chill ran down Kelly's spine as she turned toward the classroom's tall windows. The panes were grimy and streaked with dirt, but something moved behind the glass. "What was that?" Lila asked, stepping closer. James yanked her back. The notebook said not to look, but it was too late. Lila froze, her eyes wide as she stared at the window. Her flashlight fell from her hand, clattering to the floor. "Lila!" Kelly screamed, shaking her friend. Lila's lips moved, but no sound came out. Her eyes filled with terror as her body stiffened, and then she collapsed to the floor. "What's happening?" Kelly cried. The lights in the room began to flicker, and the air grew icy. A low humming sound filled the space, growing louder until it became an unbearable screech. "We have to get out of here!" James yelled. He grabbed Lila's arm and tried to drag her, but she was impossibly heavy, her body limp and unresponsive. Then the door slammed shut. Kelly spun around, yanking on the knob, but it wouldn't budge. Behind them, the blackboard screeched as words began to write themselves. "You looked. Now you stay." James screamed as the windows shattered, shards of glass flying inward. Beyond the broken panes was not the dark night they had expected, but an endless void filled with shadowy figures. Their hollow eyes locked onto the trio as bony hands began to reach through the frame. "Don't let them touch you!" James shouted, but it was useless. The hands wrapped around his wrist, pulling him toward the window. Kelly grabbed his other arm, trying to pull him back, but his screams were cut off as he was yanked into the void. The shadows surged forward, their grotesque faces pressing against the glass, grinning with jagged teeth. "Kelly, help me!" Lila cried, finally snapping out of her trance. But the room began to twist and stretch, the walls pulsating like a living organism. The doorway expanded into a dark tunnel, and Kelly could feel something watching her from its depths. "Run!" Kelly screamed, pulling Lila to her feet. They bolted for the tunnel, but as they ran, the floor gave way beneath them. Kelly fell, her screams echoing in the darkness. The next morning, the local authorities found the school exactly as it had been for years, abandoned and silent. Inside room 306, they discovered an old notebook lying open on a desk. On its last page were 3 fresh names: Kelly, James, and Lila. The window glass was intact, but if you stared at it long enough, you might see faint silhouettes, their hands pressed against the panes, forever trapped in the void.